name is Jeff Robinson, and I'm producing this series of videos based on my book, Saved by Grace Through Faith, or Saved by Decree. It's a critique of, a biblical and theological critique of Calvinism, the doctrine of salvation espoused by many Christians today of the Reformed tradition, and which I believe is fundamentally in error because not biblical. I'm tracing these series of videos in a similar way to the way my book is structured. You may recall in the first video of this series, the introduction, I stressed the distinctive feature of my book is not its message so much as the structure of the book. It's a very logically structured book, beginning with a clear presentation of the Calvinist position, followed by a biblical critique of texts that are appealed to by Calvinists to justify their viewpoint. And then the third component is the theological critiques of issues that are raised by the topic at hand. And the topic is guided by the acrostic TULIP, standing for total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. And that's the basic structure I've been following through the book and in this video series. And we're beginning with total depravity, but I've been looking at a precursor to total depravity, namely original sin. And in the previous video, we looked at, well, I mentioned some scriptures that are appealed to by Calvinists, but in reality, there's only one that is biblically plausible in support of a doctrine of original sin. That is, everyone born today is born inheriting a corrupted human nature because of Adam's sin, and also many Calvinists believe are held guilty by God again because of Adam's sin. And I noted last time that these texts, particularly Romans 5:12 through 19, really does not support a doctrine of original sin. And that the key concept in Romans 5:12 through 19 is not union with Adam and union with Christ so much as identification. Two humanities are appealed to by Paul in that passage. One who like Adam, sin personally and suffer the consequences, and another humanity who identify with Christ by faith. Now, in this video, I want to examine three theological issues that arise in connection with this belief in original sin. In my book, I give 16 reasons why the doctrine of original sin is invalid. And we'll look at three of them very briefly today. The first problem concerns what I call the personal accountability principle. And that is, it is fundamentally unjust for one person to be blamed and held responsible for the sins, the wickedness of a previous generation, say my great-grandfather. The fact that my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather murdered someone or lied or raped someone, and that I am blamed, is a fundamental injustice. I wasn't even around when he committed that sin. And this issue of sense of justice, sense of right and wrong, is not a trivial one. It's one that is given to us by God himself and hinted at in Romans 1, in fact. It's an aspect of us being created in the image of God, who of course is perfectly just, perfectly righteous. There are several Old Testament texts that undergird this idea of personal accountability, being held personally accountable for the sins you commit or I commit, not for the sins of somebody else. For example, in Deuteronomy 24:16 we read, "Fathers shall not be put to death for their sons, nor shall sons be put to death for their fathers. Everyone shall be put to death for his own sins." That's a just situation, one that original sin, a doctrine of original sin, violates. Jeremiah 31 in verses 29 through 1, speaking of a future golden age, says this: in those days they will not say this proverb that was going around in ancient Israel. The fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. This is a proverb going around to justify the punishment, perceived punishment, that the contemporary Israeli nation at that time was experiencing. They were blaming it on their fathers, the previous generations. The previous generation, the fathers have eaten the sour grapes, and now we are having to suffer the teeth being on edge. Jeremiah goes on to summarize: everyone will die for his own iniquity. So don't blame a previous generation for your current troubles. You are responsible for your current troubles. Ezekiel 18:20. The person who sins will die. The son will not bear the punishment for the father's iniquity, nor will the father bear the punishment for the son's iniquity. The righteousness of the righteous will be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked will be upon himself. But there's the key principle. The person who sins will die, not because of somebody else's sins. And as I mentioned, the doctrine of original sin violates this principle of personal accountability by making Adam ultimately responsible for my sinning. As mentioned in the previous video, the Bible knows nothing of original sin, but consistently speaks of consequences for personal sins. A second theological related issue is the problem of connection to Adam. The variety of ways in which the connection to Adam's sin as impacting current contemporary sinning is very problematic. There are three basic views put forward by scholars. One is called the seminal view. That is, Adam's sin is transmitted through sexual intercourse. This is a view held, for example, by Augustine. A second view is called the federal headship view, and this is probably the most common these days. Adam was designated formally representative of all mankind by God. So when Adam sinned, as man's representative, subsequent humankind, was also impacted and held accountable as well for that sin. The third view is called the realist view, which stresses that all people were in Adam himself when he sinned, so that when Adam sinned, all posterity sinned with him at that time. And each view has its problems, not least that in fact there is no biblical warrant for any of these three theories. And these are, in fact, in my opinion, theological constructs intended to explain how all people subsequent to Adam are sinners because of Adam. The very fact that disagreement about such a fundamental doctrine as original sin and how it connects Adam's sin to the current generation, the very fact that disagreement exists about that connection reflects the unbiblical nature of this doctrine. And then thirdly and finally, we can note the influence, the influence of Augustine on this doctrine. I make 4 points. First is, prior to Augustine, the church knew nothing of a doctrine of original sin. I'm speaking broadly, but that is broadly true. Secondly, Augustine developed this theory in the midst of disputes with another ascetic, actually monk, a British monk by the name of Pelagius. It wasn't the result of impassionate or dispassionate study of the scriptures in a systematic and careful way. It was generated in the heat of a controversy with Pelagius. Thirdly, Augustine was greatly influenced by his own sudden conversion from a life of gross immorality. His conversion experience convinced him that every aspect of salvation had to be from God alone, and that apart from God acting decisively, intervening in his life decisively to overcome his tremendous sin, he would never have turned to God at all. And then fourthly, Augustine's influence was such that subsequent generations of church councils and confessions adopted his view on original sin. Significantly, the Eastern Church, around Constantinople at that time, the Eastern Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Greek-speaking church, not the Western Latin-speaking church, did not follow Augustine, and generally speaking, do not follow a doctrine of original sin, do not believe in that. As I say, much more could be said about, theologically, about the impact of original sin. I've touched on these three or four problem areas, but I discuss 16 altogether in my book. The doctrine which lays ultimate blame for our sinning because in Adam and his sin is not a biblical notion. It is the power of tradition that has allowed the doctrine to persist down the centuries. In the next video, I'll discuss a consequence of the doctrine of original sin, namely total depravity as Calvinism understands it. Until then, bye-bye.